Hi there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I am your host, Florence Adu, coming to you from a beautiful Brooklyn morning again. I feel like that's a repeat of last week's, but morning is a great time to do recordings. And my guest is coming from not so far from here and has roots in this city as well as other places on the continent. And so I will get right to her bio because I'm so excited. So this meeting, just some background, our meeting was through another Glocal citizen, Nana Akua Hafner, and we met at her recent book launch of her latest book, My Parents' Marriage. So I'm going to put some links to all of that in the show notes so that you all can check out her new book, which sounds delicious. I can't wait to dive into it, but I had to read my guest book first because I wanted to get her on as soon as possible. And so let's get to her bio. Her critically acclaimed debut novel, Patience is a Subtle Thief, was named one of BuzzFeed's best books of May 2022 and received a coveted Kirkus-starred review. As a journalist, she has showcased her talent across a diverse range of platforms, including Elle.com, PBS, Ebony.com, CUNY TV, and more. Her career has seen her cover extraordinary people, communities, and events from New York City to Paris and from Nigeria to Ghana. In 2017, Essence Magazine named her among the Woke 100 Women for launching Beyond Classically Beautiful, an acclaimed photo story and media platform celebrating women of color who defy traditional beauty standards. After years of struggling to write a complete novel, she adopted a winning plan that helped her finish her manuscript seamlessly. She landed a deal with HarperCollins upon her first submission to a publisher. That is so dope. Kudos. And as she continues to work on her second novel, she is also coaching aspiring authors on how to write and finish the novel of their dreams. Abi Ishola-Ayodeji, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Florence. This is amazing. I appreciate all of your enthusiasm around my bio and my work. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. So let's get started. Let's jump right in. Where are you from? Where are you local? And what is your craft?
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. That would be an area called Miami Gardens. It wasn't called Miami Gardens when I was living there. It was just Miami, but it's now Miami Gardens. And my parents, they immigrated to Miami in the 70s. Had my sister and I there, and we, came of age there. However, there was a period in my life in secondary school where my parents sent my sister and I to live in Nigeria. We didn't stay for a long time, but we stayed long enough for it to have an amazing impact on my life. It is the reason I was able to write this book, and I am grateful for that time. So as I entered college, I moved to New York. I was living in Brooklyn, but going to school at the Fashion Institute of Technology in Manhattan, which was an amazing experience. Being in New York was awesome. And I've since moved to New Jersey at the start of the pandemic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So I'm not too far from New York. I was actually just in Brooklyn, and that's where I met you.
Exactly.
And so, yes, I am now in New Jersey.
Okay. And it's pretty obvious, but what is your craft?
Well, my craft, it's interesting because I started out as a journalist. When I moved to New York, I was in love with fashion at the time, and I wanted to write for all the fashion magazines. I was able to do a little bit of that, but I ended up going back to school, got a master's degree in journalism and arts and culture, and I got a job at CUNY, the City University of New York, their television station, which is like a nonprofit station, producing several stories for them, stories that ended up on PBS and stories that they had in-house. So I produced shows and stories for CUNY TV, and basically that's my craft, journalism. And while I was in school, actually while I was in undergrad, I started Patience as a Subtle Thief. It wasn't called that at the time. And it started out as a screenplay. Because at FIT, I took a screenwriting class, and I was like, I had a story about a girl who wanted to come to America, and she did it in some shady ways. But the story has since evolved a lot from that time. And at that time, I didn't know how to make a movie. So I left there saying I wanted to finish this story, but I think I need to finish it as a book. So that's how it all started.
Interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's so interesting that you started it as a screenplay because it reads so visually, which makes a lot of sense. So I was just at a writer's retreat, the Wild Seeds writer's retreat out of the Brooklyn Literary Center or the Brooklyn Center for Literature. I'm totally
I know the exact center at Medgar Evers.
Exactly. So it was their Wild Seeds retreat, and I went it was the first time they've had a cohort for screenwriting, and so that was where what I was there to do and to work on a project that I'm passionate about. And so it's so interesting that you say that it started as that because I'm just in the tools, in the technical of screenwriting versus novel writing versus this. So okay. All right. So you started it as inspiration from your time in Nigeria. So tell us a little bit more about that local, because that was a little bit of a local experience for you. So tell us a little bit more about that experience as a later adolescent, when you were there. So tell us a little bit more about that story and how it inspired Patience is a Subtle Thief.
Interesting. I would say it was somewhat of a culture shock, but in a very good way. Because when I was growing up in Miami, it was hard for me because, and I'm sure you've heard these stories for people that have African parents and they're growing up in the States. I had a very African name. My full first name is Abimbola. The short form for my name is Bimbo, which you can't say that in America. Yeah. And, I would say being dark skinned growing up in the South, a lot of people don't consider Miami the South, but it's very, very much the South, depending on where you live. And it was hard for me to navigate that. I was a very quiet child, very somewhat awkward and into myself. I wasn't really able to mix and mingle the way I would have loved to very early on in my life. Prior to my parents sending us to Nigeria, my family members would come and visit from there. And it was interesting to me to see, my mom's brother would come and he was a wealthy man, and I had never seen that kind of thing growing up in Miami. So when we went to live there, we had already visited Nigeria once. So it was a very interesting experience. It was a great experience because I got to go to school and I got to be around students that immediately understood my name, immediately understood me. So the culture shock was somewhat of goodness. It was like, oh, okay. So there is a place where I fit in this world and I don't have to explain myself so much.
Yeah.
Although being an American, there were some things that I didn't understand at the same time. And then around the time I was there, it was 1992, 1993. And it was a very pivotal time in Nigeria's political history because, there was a man named MKO Abiola who ran for president. And he was supposed to be the first democratic president of Nigeria after decades of military dictatorship. So I always describe him as the Obama of Nigeria because he ran on, his slogan was hope, and he injected hope back into the nation after, all this time of people feeling really disheartened by what was happening. And everyone voted for him once the election happened, but then the military didn't make good on their promise and they annulled the election. And I remember being in school and things are happening. There are protests happening and my classmates were like so fired up and I was only 13 years old and I'm looking at these 12 and 13-year-old students and they're all fired up about politics. And I'm like, what is this? Because, in the United States, especially at that time,
right,
Black people, and then especially young people, were not as engaged in politics.
Yeah.
Well, not all Black people, but of course a lot.
Right.
Because we didn't feel we had a place in that. So that was really interesting. And his story was interesting. So even after coming back to America, I followed his story to find out what happened because I thought it was very, very astonishing and intriguing. So in writing this book, I felt that I wanted to incorporate his story in it in some capacity. So, and I always say, I feel like I've only tipped the iceberg with that story. And I think his story should be told more and more.
Yeah. I mean, I was clueless until I'd heard about, but your book took me into, wow, okay, this was a real thing. And what's so interesting about reading this story? I felt a lot like it could have been 2024.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it could have been 2024. And so, with all these elections happening now and the idea of hope or transition, that storyline, I wish it weren't so timeless.
I agree.
If that were the story, yeah, I wish it weren't. And so we'll talk more about a little bit more of that. But so again, let's get into the Niger that you experienced. So where in the country, where in the country were you? Were you in Lagos or were you outside?
Both of my parents are from Ibadan, and a lot of my family members live there. But my uncle that we lived with, he lived in Lagos, so we were in Lagos. We went to school in Lagos. At every holiday, we go to Ibadan, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but I love Ibadan. I loved it. I loved it more than Lagos at that time because it always felt like home. It felt so cozy. My uncle's house was on one street. My grandmother's house was down the street, so we would walk to her house. Then my cousin's house was a few blocks up. So we just walk the street and just go to all these houses, sit with our family members, talk to people. It was just always so intimate. In Lagos, at least the way we grew up or were in Lagos, I should say, instead of saying grew up, it felt very isolated. We didn't always feel like we could go out, freely. My uncle would say, well, you can't go without, so-and-so, or you can't do that without. So it didn't feel as free. So I feel like we did get the balance of living in the city and that rural, very homegrown, home feeling of Africa, of Nigeria,
right.
So that was a good balance.
Okay. Which is interesting because Ibadan is still a city. So you were kind of in a small neighborhood or an enclave that was, I guess, a little bit more of another time. And so,
it's a city, but people, Lagosians, consider it like the village.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. They don't see it the same way because it's a city that's not as metropolitan. Lagos is very happening. There's so much going on
just
there.
Busy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Busy. Yeah. I went through Ibadan, I guess 2 years ago. I went to Ardex Lagos and I was visiting a friend in Ilesha. So on the way we went through Ibadan and I was like, it was so much construction. So I could tell that this is definitely a changing part. It's a big highway was being done. We had so much traffic. I mean, there's always traffic in, most stop towns, but I appreciated that it is a town on a hill or city on a hill.
Yeah.
And so that always warms my heart. So I can sense, I'm just imagining that was kind of where you were. It's like, okay, this house is on this side of the hill, that side. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah. But it's interesting too, because there's hills and valleys.
Right.
So I know they call it okay, which is above, and then ED. Like my mom is from Idi in Ibadan, which is ED means the bottom.
Okay.
So it's like your butt, to translate, but it's like the bottom. So there's okay, which is the height, which is the hills, and then ED, which are the valleys.
Okay.
So it's a very interesting and very cool city to see when you go up top and you look down.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. So then how do you go from secondary school in Nigeria to come back to find yourself as a writer? Because that's a bit different than, what we would expect of our typical African family. So tell us that story.
Well, one thing I will say is that my parents were not the kind of Nigerian parents that stressed that we needed to be doctors, accountants, lawyers, etc.
Wonderful.
My dream was to be a lawyer for a very long time. My uncle that I lived with was a lawyer, and he's somebody that I feel he was a mentor of mine, and I wanted to be like him in a lot of ways. But I realized that writing was really my passion, especially as I started to fall in love with fashion when I was still living in Miami. I wanted to write about shows and clothing and models, and that was my dream. And my dad, I always say that I think he was someone that appreciated the arts, but wasn't as open about it as I think he should have been. He probably would have been a really good artist himself. He knew how to sketch things that were really interesting. And I always felt supported by them. in terms of what I want it to be. My sister's story may be a little different from mine because she's older than me. But I think by the time by the time I became of age, I think my parents were a little tired and they were like, this girl has her own thing going on. Let her fly and do whatever she needs to do. So yeah, I never felt the pressure to not be a writer or to not pursue creative things. I never felt that from them.
Okay, wonderful. That's nice. And so you mentioned the fashion as a passion. And so I'm assuming that's how you came into this concept of the Beyond Classically Beautiful platform. And so how did you brainchild it and nurture it?
Fashion was interesting because when I started out in fashion, I realized that it wasn't really what I thought it was going to be like. And I think a lot of people have that as their story. You know, I always say, like, when you watch The Devil Wears Prada, it's very true. It's like a true story for a lot of people that dipped their toe into fashion and didn't necessarily stay on course. Okay. There were things about it that I appreciated it, but I felt like I needed to kind of broaden my horizons and learn how to write about other things, you know, culture and the arts and not just fashion. But it was always something, as you said, that I was interested in. And beauty was always something that I was interested in as well, because my story is very much about colorism and overcoming that and experiencing it in a way that was in some ways debilitating as a child when I was a child, and I was able to get over that. So for me, what happened with Beyond Classically Beautiful is interesting because the New York Times at the time, they wrote an article about Viola Davis. And in the article, they called her less classically beautiful than Halle Berry. So of course, it was very triggering for lots of Black women. And at the time, you know, I went on Twitter to see what people were saying. And of course, it went viral. And all of the Black women, including light-skinned women, were writing in solidarity with Viola Davis. I guess I'm less classically beautiful as the hashtag. And I sat there and I'm looking at less classically beautiful and how we were owning that, you know, how so many Black women were owning it in solidarity with her. And I thought it was beautiful. But at the same time, I didn't want to accept it. So Beyond Classically Beautiful is what popped into my head. And when that popped into my head, I was blogging at the time. I had a blog and I would go take pictures of people in the streets of New York, talk about their fashion and what they were wearing. And it was really interesting at the time and fun. So my husband, who was a photographer, I asked him, I said, listen, we should do a photo series and feature Black women of all shades, sharing their story about what they went through in terms of beauty. What's their story? And then someone else that I teamed up with, who's a makeup artist, she's amazing. She did all the makeup and she also did some of the styling. So we got together and we put this project together and we released it on my blog and it went viral. I wasn't expecting that because at the time I was just creating content for my blog, but it took off. I think Post was the first people to post it. A friend of mine who was a part of it, she was working there and she was like, this has to go up. She posted it, and once she posted it, lots of people came. Elle.com interviewed me and Pop Sugar and just so many publications were interested in it and they reposted it. So I thought this was great. So I created a platform. Instead of continuing with my blog, I renamed my blog Beyond Classically Beautiful and made it more about Black women versus just taking pictures of people in the street. So I would, at that point, interview women in the streets about their beauty and what they've experienced and how they feel about themselves. And also we did other photo series. There was a point where Serena Williams was being targeted about her body, you know, as a tennis player. And it's like, are you kidding me? It was just the most ridiculous thing being said about her. And we now embarked on Body More. I said, you know, let's do something to celebrate Black women in their bodies. And that also took off. It went viral. People loved it. Essence picked it up first, I believe. And then it just kept going from there. So we had a nice run of creating beautiful images of beautiful Black women and Black women in general and celebrating Black women. And that's what that was all about. At the moment, I leave it up as an archive, but it's no longer in operation.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was work. It's a lot of work in your work transition. So I absolutely get it. And so thinking about work and the business of operating a platform, how did you sustain it while you were in the midst of it?
Well, that was the hard part. That was the hard part. I had people that used to write for me for the blog. They would write news stories. We would feature Black women who were influencers, and this was before, like I would say, video took off. It was more like photos, and everyone was posting beautiful images on Instagram. So we would like interview women that were doing that and repost things. And I just made the time. I would do it at nighttime. I would do it, during my free time.
So this was in addition to your day job?
This was in addition to working at Candy TV full time and having my daughter full time.
Yeah.
So it was definitely a labor of love.
Sure.
It's a labor of love, and we really enjoyed the run. But there did come a point where I felt like I didn't know how to monetize it. Didn't know how to monetize it in order to keep it going.
Exactly.
So that's why right now it's an archive. But I always say that my work is always in some way a reflection of Black women. I'm always talking about Black girls, what their plight might be, whether it be in Nigeria or here. The book that I'm writing now is that. So my work will always be that. So this is just a new chapter in my life where I'm writing fiction.
Okay. Yeah. So you in the sense of how it evolved and where the roots of Beyond Classically Beautiful are is activism, right? And so when you think about your journalistic self, you talked about going in and talking about fashion. That wasn't necessarily activist, but it seems like looking at your body of work now that activism is a strong theme. So did you think that, and do you think that as you approach work and writing these days?
I did, actually. I used to peg myself as a beauty activist. I knew one person, I believe her name is Michaela Angela Davis. Yes, Michaela Angela Davis called herself an image activist, which I thought was such a cool term. And I think she pegged the term. So I would say beauty activism. And I thought that it was really important. I still think it's very important because what some people don't realize is that our self-image is really important to our self-esteem and how we end up showing up in the world. And how, we may or may not feel entitled to good things or even to go out for our dreams. So it's something that's always in the back of my mind, even as I raise my daughter, thinking about how to make sure her self-image is something that she holds dear and something that she can grasp and decide, this is who I am and this is who I want to be in this world. And I won't allow anyone else to shake me to the point where I don't feel like I belong here. So that's always in the back of my mind. And I say what I'm writing now, and I think so much about that because right now it's all over here. Like, okay, what else am I going to say about this girl, this character? Right. So yes, I do consider myself a beauty activist. However, I do struggle with the idea of it being accepted as something important or serious or necessary. So what I do is I allow it to be what it is to people.
Sure.
If you see this as something that's important for you or your child or whomever, that's wonderful. But I don't necessarily brand myself that way, if that makes sense.
It's just the story of a creative, ultimately, right? Like you exactly. Paint a picture or whatever, it's let's just leave it as it is, and however it's consumed is the fruit of whomever has decided to take a bite, right?
Yes. Thank you for describing it that way, because that's basically what it is. And that makes me feel even better that people can understand it that way. So thank you. Yeah.
So speaking of words like the hashtags and all those things, I want to ask you about Glocal speak. So we want to hear what you hear. So please share a word, a phrase, or a saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience and why or how you've come to value it as Glocal speak.
Oh my God. A word or phrase that is a meaningful part of my experience. Yes. The thing that just popped into my head is, I believe I don't want to misquote who said this, and I don't know the exact quote, but I know it's about the crown has already been earned. All you have to do is put it on. And I believe it's Maya Angelou, but it could be Nikki Giovanni. Okay. That is what popped into my head. And interestingly enough, Yoruba people are very much about Ade, 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 which is the crown. And my daughter, we named her Tejumade, which is eyes on the crown. And then I think about my own family where there is some royalty sprinkled in. And, different people have different opinions about royalty and what that means. And I feel that for me, the crown represents pride in oneself, pride in one's culture, knowing thyself, knowing that your ancestors have already done the work and paid the price. But it's our responsibility to step into the shoes of which God has, laid before us. It's our responsibility to push past anything that may be holding us back or self-doubt and really own why we're here. So that would be what I would say. And that's been on my mind a lot lately too.
I love that though. Own why we are here, because I think so many people are just passive observers or passive, I want to say beings on this earth and not really captivated by the idea of a why. And so the more people hear about it, the more they might question and be more active in the future or the present that they're invested in. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. You're welcome.
So let's talk a little bit more. I want to do a little bit of a reverse because you mentioned, and it's my why the where question. So you mentioned moving to Jersey during the pandemic or after the pandemic. And so a lot of people made those kinds of moves from the city to different places. And so I want to ask why the where. How did you come to be living, working, and playing where you currently are located? And share.
Great question. Well, before the pandemic, we actually were trying to move to this part of New Jersey, but it didn't work out.
Oh, okay.
And I guess before even describing New Jersey, I would backtrack and say that being in New York when I was in Miami, moving to New York was like my dream. It was like 2017. Yeah. And we were like, well, we'll just wait. I think it was a bigger dream for me than going to the school I went to. So what I did was I had to be in New York. What schools are there? Right. So it was just, I was obsessive about leaving Miami to live in New York because I just knew that there was something about this place that would embrace me.
Yes.
And I was absolutely correct. So I feel like it was definitely God that led me here. And I used to tell my husband, because we've been together for a long time before we got married. And I would tell him, like, I didn't move to New York to move to New Jersey. Because, everyone would, like, when they get married and settle down, they move to New Jersey, they buy a house. Yeah. It's very cliche in my mind at that time. And he would just laugh because his brother lived in New Jersey and, So I was like holding on to New York and Brooklyn in particular, because I lived in Bed-Stuy for about 20 years before we moved.
Yeah, that's the life.
Yeah, it became home. And I think seeing Bed-Stuy change was difficult, especially towards the end. Honestly, I think I was asleep for a while. And then one day I woke up and I'm like, what is going on?
Right. Yeah.
Oh my God. It was interesting. And then there was a point where when we realized that change, we wanted to be a part of it. So we're like, okay, we can't leave now.
Right.
Because it's changed and we want to like be here to see what happens. But once you have children, life becomes different. It becomes very different. And I always say I paid my dues in Brooklyn. We had an amazing time. But some of the things that used to be very easy to do became difficult to do because of how it changed and also because we had kids. So at that point, we needed to leave. And when 2020 happened, I would say 2019, my husband and I decided, okay, let's go down south. Let's move to Atlanta. In April or May, we'll go and check it out. We'll go like visit, because we've been there before, but we wanted to check out like where we wanted to live. And then we'll make the move. March happened.
Right. So it was really unrelated to the pandemic.
Well, we were planning to move right before that. Like we were planning that in like April 2020 or May 2020 we would move. Yeah. But once March happened, we're like, how are we going to move to that place? Like everything was shut down. Nobody was advertising for jobs. And, we thought, we'll just, transfer, get a job. Like it just derailed everything. So the thought was, well, let's go back to our original plan of living in New Jersey. Because remember, we were looking at Maplewood, New Jersey in 2017. And that didn't work out. So when 2020 happened, we were like quarantined. My son was like 1 year old. And my daughter was, 5, 6? And it was hard to be quarantining with two very young children in an apartment.
Yeah.
So we just packed our bags and we moved to New Jersey. And we were renting for a while, and we knew that at some point we would start looking for a home. And we did, and we're here now. And I have to say that I love it here.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I love it. Yes.
They don't call it the Garden State for no reason. Like Jersey, it's quite nice. So I never poo-poo it as people trying to poo-poo Jersey because it's just trees and you know that you're looking at Atlanta, it has a little bit of that kind of like when you are in those kinds of you know rolling hills of trees. So kudos to you and the fam for finding your what can I call it?
Our new home.
Your haven, exactly. Your new haven, exactly.
You should have seen me in Brooklyn when I came the other day. When I was coming into the what is it called? The Center for Fiction.
Center for Fiction.
I was like skipping down the street. I looked like, oh my God. I was so disoriented in downtown Brooklyn. And then like people were like, oh, I love your dress. I'm like, oh my God, Brooklyn. You know, Brooklyn has like that energy that you just cannot replicate anywhere.
So true.
It also humbles you. Like what happened to me that day, I drove in. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna park at Target. There's that, you know, the parking lot there. I'm just gonna park there and I'm gonna walk there. Everything's fine, and I'm gonna get something to eat first. I looked down the street at Lafayette, and I'm like, I should turn here, but I didn't. So I kept going. And if you know how it is driving down there, at some point you can't turn left anymore. So I had to keep going and going and going. And I'm like, Brooklyn, you will always humble people. You will always humble people. Oh my God. So I ended up getting a quick slice of pizza at this old pizza place I used to go to. Very nostalgic for me. And then I'm skipping down the street like,
I love it. So, I love it.
Yeah, that's my local.
Yeah, your other local. But no, it's a great story. It's a wonderful story. So now I want to talk about Patience as that subtle thief that she really is. And not to give too much about the book because I really want people to encourage people to read it. I would say at times when I was reading it, I was like so heartbroken at times. And I know that that's the way of, you know, writing a good story. But I was always struck with how well you wrote your characters. And you have so many, the characters were deep in such a short amount of time. Like, you know, again, coming off of a retreat, like character development was big on my mind. Where did you reach in to find and have the ability to create those characters? And maybe this is a little bit of into your coaching space, but tell us more about how you were able to create those characters in the span of a novel, because it's not an easy thing. And there's many of them that you really haven't I can have a personal like understanding and say, oh, that character, that character.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Because writing a book is so hard, as everyone knows, if you've ever attempted it. And it took me a long time. But I'll also say that, and I've said this before in an interview, that listening to people's stories is a big one for me. And I think interviewing people over the years, meeting so many Nigerians in Brooklyn, and then also really paying close attention to things when I was in Nigeria. Like there's things that I never forgot. There's a scene in the book where there's an Okada accident and the Okada falls. That actually happened like down the street from where I live. So there were things that I witnessed and I saw, and I felt like these things belong in a book, you know. And there were also things that I just intuitively felt. Patience is, in a lot of ways, loosely based on a few people that I know.
Right. I was imagining.
Yeah. Her story of being a girl who was taken from her mother by her father, who banishes her mother, is a very true story for a lot of girls in Nigeria. And I always felt like, you know, because here in the States, it's like if the parents split up, the mother usually takes the child, you know, or the children. But in Nigeria, I kept hearing these stories about how, oh, her dad took her and gave her to another wife, or her dad took her and raised her, or her dad took her and gave her to family. And I'm like, wow, like that's the thing. And, you know, not to judge, because I try not to judge, and because I know that different cultures we're all different. And we all see things in a different way, and there are reasons for this that we all can't always explain. Yeah. But I always wonder what that does to the girl. What does that do to you? And I knew girls that experienced that. Even some girls in my family experienced that. And I look at the way they behave and interact, and I'm like, my husband's always like, you're always psychoanalyzing people. I'm like, well, right. I'm a writer. So that's a good thing, because you're able to kind of dig into like what this could do to someone and how it can make them really feel, and what decisions they make based on things that have happened to them. And then, like the men in the story, another thing that I did with like Mayowa, for example, Mayowa for me represented the people of Nigeria at that time. He represented the hope in Nigeria, like people that really hope for change and what would be different, and people that weren't willing to compromise on how they felt things could be, And of course, Chike represented that somewhat one foot in, one foot out. Like maybe this could happen because, things were so hard, but at the same time, things don't really happen for people like me. So that was what I went off of. And then, of course, his brother Emeka represents somewhat of the greed in Nigeria, where people that they have maybe lost all hope and maybe don't see any other way. And this is who we have to be to survive. So that was what I was able to pull from bigger topics and how that could manifest into a person, thinking of themes, and I just talked about themes on my YouTube channel. Themes are very important for books, in my opinion, or any story, because anytime you're stuck and you don't know what to do with a character or a situation, think back to what is the theme of the story and what is the theme of this character? What can I draw from to decide what he does next or what she's thinking? So of course, one of my big themes was patience, and then losing hope for being patient. And also, I don't want to say desperation, but what do you do when you've waited for something for so long and it doesn't come? Like, what does that do to people? So that was what I kept asking myself as I was writing. So I think when people establish a theme for the story overall, and even for each character, things will be easier to write.
That's great advice. And I think it's great segue into the space that you're in now of both writing and also coaching and coming up. So how did you come up with and then follow it? Because you mentioned that you started the book long ago. And so when did you decide, okay, this is how I'm going to approach it? And then it really worked. And then you got that deal, because that's a great story.
Yeah, it took a while. And it took a while because, I wasn't doing it full time. And I kept putting it down because I had children. I went to grad school. There were so many different things I was doing. And I think if I had the time to just devote, maybe if I had gotten an MFA or, did something like that, maybe it would have happened quicker. But at the same time, I think I changed too as a person, which helped with writing. When you're able to see where your worldview changes, versus the way your worldview is when you're maybe fresh out of college. So that helped. But from writing it to getting a deal, very long and interesting story. But what I'll say is that Nana Abu-Hammond, or Nana Akua-Abu-Hammond, who's now Nana Akua-Hafner, who we both know, she was very instrumental in me getting to this point. And I always have to say her name. And, I think that God sends earth angels, and she's definitely one. Early on, she would read my work. Like, I remember I wrote the first 50 pages and I sent it to her. And this was like, oh my God, this was like over a decade ago. I can't even remember when it was so long ago. And she read it and she liked it. And I think sometimes you just need that mustard seed, as I say. That's all you need, that little thing. And of course, I put it down. And when I picked it back up, I remember reaching out to her again. But she had moments of being very busy, which I understood. She couldn't always read it, but I would find other friends to read it. My husband read it like a million times, which helped because he grew up in Lagos. So after that, there was a point where I'm like, okay, I'm finished. I'm done. I'm going to go look for an agent and like blah, blah, blah. So I queried I want to say 3 agents, and one got back to me, and he was another mustard seed, because she was like, it's not quite right for me, but here's what I think you need to do. And her advice was amazing. And it made me feel like, okay, someone thought this was okay enough So I'm on the right track. You know, sometimes you just need to know that you're not crazy.
Yeah.
Like, tell me I'm not crazy. Is this okay? So from that point, I reached out to Nana again. I'm like, Nana, I need an agent. Do you know who's your agent? You know, can you point me to anyone? And she told me to send her my work. And I did. And she basically said there's a lot I needed to work on. And she sent it back with lots of red ink. And I was like, oh no. And then she's like, send me the full thing. And then I sent her the full thing because at first it was just the first few chapters. And then after that, she sent it back and she's like, there are things that you need to work on. However, if you can get it right, HarperCollins told me to look out for great work. I'm like, HarperCollins, oh my God. You know, and then I got all nervous because I'm like, oh my God, it's not right. I spent all these years working on this and it's not right. I had to go to therapy about it. My therapist was like, just do the corrections, just do what you need to do. And I did. And it took me, again, I was working full time, parent of 2 at that point, and it took me about a year to get it to the point where, and the pandemic happened. And when the pandemic happened, I said, I'm going to finish this. I finished it, sent it to Nana, and she said, it's ready. I'll show it to them. And that's how I got my deal.
Did the story change much, or was it just different kinds of tools? Like what changed in that process that made it ready?
Well, all of Nana's suggestions were absolutely on point, and I knew that they were. I think as a writer, you know when the story is not right. And sometimes you may try to tell yourself, that's fine, it's enough because you spend so much time on it and you're tired of it. So Nana had questions about structure and like certain things that happened that like certain things that Patience was doing, although we hadn't met her dad in the story. So, and that was true. It's like, okay, the readers need to see her interact with her dad. So I had to figure out how to basically create a new beginning for the story. And also chip away at some characters, eliminate some things. And for me, it was interesting because I didn't really know how to start the story. Because I think sometimes we become so married to how we write. Like, oh, this is great. You know, you think you've written something that's just so amazing. And you don't want to let go of it, but you need to. So I was able to finally say, okay, it's time to let go of this and create a new beginning. And once I figured out the new beginning, it was all up from there.
Nice. It's kind of like a puzzle, right? It's kind of like just putting,
Oh my God, yes. I always say that. Like, you're putting the pieces together. Sometimes parts that you've written could work in a different place. So you shouldn't necessarily think you have to dump it, but maybe rethink it. And then I also describe it as kind of like a sculpture, like chipping away at it, like slowly, like, okay.
Yeah.
And that's where I am now with my book now. I'm like, okay.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, having to think differently. And so this is a good time to ask about your mindset hack. So what is your favorite mindset hack? This is one that you might practice, one that you imagine, or one that you just can think of.
For me, mindset is huge because I am always thinking about everything at the same time. And I have to figure out how to basically focus. That's my thing. So here's what I do. Like right now, I deleted Instagram. I'll probably put it back on my phone tomorrow. But I sometimes have to like check out, and sometimes my friends are like, well, why didn't you answer? I'm like, I'm trying to focus. The other thing, and I talk about this on my YouTube channel as well, you have to kind of trick your mind to writing. Like, for example, here's a trick that I have. I figured out my soundtrack, right? When I was writing Patience is a Subtle Thief. I love writing in Brooklyn coffee shops when I was living there. But sometimes the music is like so distracting because I'm in love with music. I love music. Sound is really important to me. So I had to start listening to, on YouTube, a Texas rainstorm, like white noise, but it's a rainstorm. So now every time when I hear that rainstorm, it's like, it's time to write. Like it became my signal to write. And also I listened to a lot of Fela Kuti, his instrumentals when I was writing my story, because as you know, Lagos is a big part of the story. I feel like Lagos is like a character in the story. So his pace and his music helped me with my pacing. So that was one hack. The other hack is going to the coffee shop, because I would take like a week off from work because I had to learn how to write from anywhere because, of course, I had family. And so sometimes I would write in the living room with my husband and my kids and figure it out at that moment. But when I would take a week off from work and go to a coffee shop, my mind already knew, like, okay, first of all, you're taking your vacation time and you are spending money being in this coffee shop, food, drinks all day. So you got to write. So anytime I would do that and start to think that way, I would bang out chapter after chapter after chapter. So I think what I'm saying is that you have to find your thing. Like, what is going to force you to sit down and get it done? It may be different for other people because some people may be like, I don't mind spending a lot of money at the coffee shop. I did. And my husband would be like, every day. I'm like, listen. And then also that vacation time, it's like,
Right.
I would love to be on the beach rather than working, but I have to get it done. So you have to figure out what's going to force you to be in your zone because you have to find the zone. You know, a lot of athletes talk about being in the zone and musicians talk about being in the zone. But as a writer, how do you find the zone? Because we don't necessarily have the beat, you know, or we don't necessarily have the team around us, you know, to help us. We have to figure it out for ourselves.
So it's part coaching, part mindset hacking, I love it. But yeah, the soundtrack is huge. Definitely.
Yeah, that was big for me. Even to this day, when I hear that Texas rainstorm, I'm like, okay, I just start writing. It's like, it's a trigger. Even if the writing isn't perfect, it's just, you need to just get it out. Just bang it out. Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about you, a little bit about what you do when you're not doing the thing that is the writing. But we want to know who Abi is when she's not producing, when she's not writing, when she's not coaching. And so who are you in your leisure time? Are you a reader, a watcher, or a listener? And what are some of your favorite reads, watches, or listens? Or what other things do you busy yourself?
In my private time, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm an aunt, which I also take very seriously.
Yeah.
I'm a sister, the child of a mother who's very in love with her children. It's very like overbearing, but I love that in some ways.
Yeah.
But I am also a watcher. I think I'm more of a watcher than a reader, which I'm working on. That's another thing that I have to really kind of train my mind to do is sit and have time to read and make it a priority because it is important to read so that you know that you're on the right track. When I was writing Patience is a Subtle Thief, I would read a lot of work from other African authors, and I felt like they gave me permission because when I would read it, and I'm like, okay, this feels like I'm on the right track. So that's another reason why reading is really important as a writer. But I am definitely a watcher. I love sound. I love listening to music and listening to books. I love watching television and film that make me think about storytelling. So I watch when I'm watching TV, I watch as a writer. And my husband's always like, just watch it. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the inciting incident. You know, like I'm kind of nerdy like that. So I'm definitely more of a watcher that's moving back towards being a reader. Because before the pandemic, I would read 2 books a month at least.
Oh, wow.
But for some reason, I haven't been able to get my brain back to that.
Sure. Yeah. Which is understandable. I mean, because life has taken on a whole new life.
Yeah.
Life is life. Yeah. But so what are some of your favorite watches lately?
Oh, it's interesting that you say that because although I am a watcher, I feel like, and I just had this conversation, that there's not a lot of great TV right now. I don't know if it's just me or maybe I'm checking out because I'm writing more, but recently we watched The Shy, which I don't like to critique people's work in public necessarily, but I'm not as in love with it as I was before, but we still watch it. What else do I love? We used to be really huge Game of Thrones fans. I say we because my husband and I, that's something we do a lot together. Yeah. What else? Oh, Sex Education. That was a big one for us.
Oh, yeah.
I love that show.
Yeah.
What else? Ooh, I'm drawing a blank, but there's so many things that we watch. Movies too. Like when movies come out, we definitely watch.
That's nice. Yeah, I have to say that I read quite a bit to write, but then I should watch more to create, the visual content that I create. And it's hard because it's hard, as you're saying, it's hard sifting through, and then you feel like you watch something, you wasted your time, and then you're just like, oh my gosh. So I feel you on that, most definitely.
Yeah. I would say maybe look for things that you feel are comps. You know, interestingly enough, when I was querying people, I used The Shy as a comp for my book because I felt like I couldn't think of another book that was comparable. So, and then at the time, I felt like The Shy had some elements that made me feel like, okay, this is about life for people that are just trying to make it in a city where things are not always so easy. So, looking for things that are similar. Ironically, we just watched the show. What is it called? Everyone's talking about it. About sickle cell and the superhero.
Super Cell.
Super Cell.
Yeah, I watched that one. That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the irony is, right before we watched it, I kid you not, we were in church and something popped in my head. Write a book about a girl with sickle cell. And I'm like, it was so weird hearing that. But it wasn't, because my niece had sickle cell. She doesn't have it anymore. She had a bone marrow transplant. So, yeah. So as we're watching Super Cell, I didn't know what it was about at first.
Yeah.
And then we're watching it. I'm like, oh my God. So I think it's good to watch things, because books are great, but sometimes movies and series will inspire you as a writer.
Yeah. Right.
So,
right. Exactly. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, Abby, this has been such a lovely conversation. I really appreciate you taking time out from all the things that are summer in the suburbs.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah. So do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
I don't. I can't think of anything right now. I would just say that if you're having any struggles, or if you're feeling like you want to give up, just don't give up. Don't give up on your story, and don't give up on yourself as a writer. It's hard for everyone. It's hard for, Toni Morrison took a while before she wrote her first book. You know, everyone has to have that time to flesh out, to really get the story out, and to have it make sense to you and to other readers. So just be easy on yourself and give yourself grace, and don't give up.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. That's great last words.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, listeners, this has been another episode of the podcast. You can catch us Tuesdays with new episodes at glocalcitizenspod.com or wherever you get your podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, leave us a review. We're still looking for that 100 in 2024, folks. So come on and give us a review. We really want to know what you think. And please do check our show notes, because they will be quite rich, and you can find out where you can get Abby's book, where you can find out about her coaching services, all those wonderful things that are about show notes and giving you the greatest information possible. So until next time, bye for now.